One of my goals for this year with the newcomers is how do we have a better Canadian immigrant conversation instead of this immigrant good, that immigrant bad, or have a conversation where it always feels like as if it's Canada versus the immigrant. Like, I disagree that we should have that sort of conversation because I don't think any good thing comes out of it down the line. And so I got David Moscrop, who writes an amazing Substack and had this beautiful piece where he talks about how the danger of the cynical discourse we have around immigration. I'm going to share the piece in the show notes, but what we did explore was we talked about like how do we switch the conversation from one that's abstract to a more human conversation. We also talked about the importance of building solidarity with ourselves, Canadians, immigrants, because in the end, it's really us. There's no Canada versus the immigrant. There's Canada. That's all. And whatever bad thing that comes out of all these things we're doing these days, it's all going to affect us all. But let's get to it. Enjoy. I think for me, the way I want to kind of start this off is you had this, you published this really interesting article about how cynical the immigration conversation has become, and like the problems that where that's going to take us to. Like it's scary to think about, and I think for me is from, you probably mentioned that a bit, but I want to kind of expand because I feel like with articles we usually have to write within a certain word count because we probably want to write 1,000 words or 2,000 words sometimes. But where do you think this hostility is coming from, and like where is it coming from your perspective, and what are the biggest factors we think driving it? I mean, the easy ones, everyone says housing, all those people need to survive, but like, do you think it's deeper than that, or you think that that's just what's driving it, all those things?
I think it's a little bit deeper than that. I think resources are always going to pit individuals and groups against one another. That could be an artificial limit on resources, or it could be a real limit on resources. But as soon as you have a perceived or a real scarcity of resources, there's going to be a conflict of some sort. It can be more or less peaceful, it can be more or less productive, but there's going to be some sort of conflict. And so I do think that a lot of this is about at least a perceived and in some cases real scarcity of resources. So housing, jobs, healthcare, transit, like right on down the line. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter who's causing that scarcity. Like it could be immigrants, or it could be more Canadians are being born in Canada. But someone's going to look and say, well, we need to blame somebody for the scarcity. And we're not going to blame ourselves, the politicians, for not building enough housing, enough transit, or having enough doctors. So we'd better blame the immigrants who 15 minutes ago we were begging to come to this country. And so I think that's one of the primary drivers. And then of course under that there's always a group of people who are just straight up xenophobic, anti-immigrant, racist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of people who have started to just sour on immigration aren't like that. They've just been conditioned to expect that there's a scarcity problem, and that scarcity problem is being driven by newcomers. And then I think that's what's driving a lot of this. So it's not just housing, but if I had to pick one thing that's driving a lot of that concern, it would be housing, because people can't afford the rent, can't afford the mortgage. And once you can't afford that, you're cooked. You can't afford anything.
Yeah. Because I mean, I know that I was in Vancouver sometime last year, and I just couldn't get over the amount of people who were just on the streets. Like I went out at night, and it was scary to think, because I think what happened, I had been to Calgary downtown. I live in Calgary, and I saw people on the streets, but I didn't really, I did not, it didn't really click that day for me. Like I saw people carrying bags, you see people sitting down, and it didn't click. But Vancouver was like the theme for me. I was like, oh wow, like this is actually a problem. And like you're right, is once people start trying to survive, and homelessness is a terrible thing. Like we can probably we have where to sleep, and there's no food. we can find a way to somehow manage. But then once you're now on the streets carrying a backpack, walking around, that becomes it's scary. It's
Yeah, and it's very, very difficult to get out of that situation once you're in it. And on top of that, there's uh, a drug poisoning crisis in this country that's killing people. That's disabling people, and we haven't figured that out. And then these communities form out on the streets, whether it's in parks or whether it's around shelters or whatever it might be. And those are real communities. I lived in Vancouver for the better part of 10 years, and I would go downtown. I'd go to the downtown east side, and I would see scores of people together. And yeah, they were homeless or they were living in single resident occupancy buildings, whatever it might be, but that was their community. And then what do we do is the police come in and they bust up those communities and shoot people along. And so people lose their connection to those communities. And that is a devastating blow for them too. And so, but it does then speak to our capacity or our tendency to want to vilify people rather than look at our politicians and say, well, what the hell happened here? And I think so you can draw a line from the homelessness, from the drug poisoning crisis, right on down to immigration and say there's this common theme. That common theme is politicians are like, well, it wasn't us. Like, yes, but it was. But it was you. You make the decisions.
Gosh. Yeah.
Like, we got to blame somebody. I'm not going to blame the person who's addicted to opioids. I'm not going to blame the person who never had a fair shot in life, never got to go to school, and wasn't born into the right family. It's whatever. I'm going to blame the politicians who oversee a country where that sort of thing can happen. Because there are countries where it doesn't happen, or it happens a lot less. And you're like, well, why can't we have that?
And that's so right, because I know you mentioned somewhere in your piece where you talk about that thing where it's the policy versus the people instead of the people as a policy, because just that distinction itself, it still follows that same thread down from how you treat people who things didn't work out for them as it should have because of the system we live in, all the way down to immigrants you bring into the society, and then you go like, you know what, you're expendable, you're the next thing I can use as my crutch for the reason why XYZ isn't working.
Or we can bring you in, use you, and then throw you away when we're done. And one of the things that motivated me to write about immigration in the piece you're referring to was the temporary foreign worker program, which was called by one investigator a modern slavery program.
Jeez.
And there was a labor shortage in this country, quote unquote, labor shortage. And the premiers and the business community wanted cheap labor to fill it. And they didn't want to pay people here a decent wage. And they didn't want to bring newcomers in and make them permanent residents and Canadian citizens. They wanted to bring in temporary labor, keep labor prices down, fill the gap in folks that needed to work at Tim Hortons or whatever it might be. And then when it was done, like, okay, thanks, get on home. We're done with you. And the country turned on those folks so fast as soon as things got a little bit tough. And it was just one of the most sickening and cynical things. And it was one of the reasons I thought, you know what, even if it were a real close race in my riding between a liberal and a conservative, I don't think I could in good conscience bring myself to vote for the liberal, because I found that to be so cynical and gross, because they just stopped treating those people as human beings. And I'm like, well, it's hard to forgive that.
Yeah. It's I mean, I had this piece I released last week, and he's an RCIC Blaine, and he said something which I just can't I can't stop thinking about it. He said it is criminal that we take people from somewhere and then bring them to Canada and further impoverish them. Like, if we further make their lives worse than it was wherever they were, like, that is actually criminal, because like you said, it is gross, it's cynical, it's inhumane. it's all sorts of horrible. Like, it's better to say don't come, like don't
Mhm.
come, than say come, and then you come into the country, and then all of a sudden you are basically being told you need to get the fuck out of here, because if you don't, I am going to probably send some police people after you. And then the person now starts to, like, it's just, oh God.
I know. And I remember a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, something like that, I was writing about immigration. I talked to some immigrant resettlement organization or settlement organizations, and they were saying, people will come here from wherever they're coming, and they'll get here and they'll say, "Uh-oh," right? Like, I can't find a house I can afford. I can't navigate the city. It's less welcoming than I thought it would be. I can't, get the job that I hoped for or wanted. I can't support myself the way I could. I can't afford to live here. And it sort of made immigrants wary of immigrants, because that resource scarcity struggle then turned on other immigrants. And so people sometimes scratch their heads and say, how can an immigrant be against immigration? And the answer is, well, because there's this battle for scarce resources. And sometimes people are like, oh no. But the immigration resource groups themselves are saying, it's too many people, and this is the core part, compared to our capacity to settle them. And this is where the conversation from day one really, really should have gone, rather than there's too many people coming. I'm like, too many people relative to what? To the space we have? No, we got lots of space. To the multicultural fabric of the country? Nope. Lots of people from all over the world who do great here, and it's fantastic. Too many people compared to the resources that our politicians have made available for the population, right? Because if tomorrow there were 400,000 new Canadians born to Canadian citizens, there would be too many Canadians, because we wouldn't have the transit for them, the housing for them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's relative to something. I'm like, well, then let's talk about that. Let's talk about the problem, which is we don't have enough doctors and hospitals and nurses and people to clean the hospitals and ambulances on the road. We don't have enough good paying jobs for people. We don't have enough houses to house them. We don't build non-market housing anymore, so there aren't affordable houses for people. There aren't the transit in this country in major cities is a joke. Toronto traffic is, forget about it. So yeah, there's a problem. We haven't built this capacity. And who's to blame for that? It's not the newcomers. It's not their job. It's not the workers who are responding to what their bosses are telling them to do. It's the politicians who are making the rules. But they don't want to own that. In fact, they're coming back to us today asking, re-elect us in Ontario, re-elect us in British Columbia, re-elect us in Ottawa, for the federal government. And I'm like, what have you done for me lately? It's frustrating. So I get really, really irritated by it really, really fast.
Yeah, it is a sad thing to see, honestly, because I totally get that thing. I remember when I was moving and I said, you get here and you instantly feel the pressure. Like, you just instantly feel the pressure that, okay, like, this is going to be some work. Yeah, this is going to be some work. And you start to ask, it's part of why I started this, because I said to myself that one thing I wasn't going to do was I wasn't going to feel like a victim about it. I was just going to face it and say, you know what? Like, how do we tell these stories? How do we help people find their way? How do we help people just find their way around the system and hopefully change something along the way? Because you're right, you get here and if you're not careful, you get into the situation where you start saying, I don't think anyone else should come, because I don't even have a job, right? Like, I am trying to get a job and you don't have a job. And it's just like, oh, so when the next person comes and you're now 12 of us hunting for a job. And in the end, humans will try to survive.
Mm-hmm.
It is the scary thing about us, is that we are humans, but with the right conditions, we quickly descend down to being like animals. We start literally doing what the jungle, only the strongest survive. And it's so easy for us to do that. And just kind of building on that is, I want to kind of explore two questions with you, which is, one is, Daniel Bernhard said, and I love that. I love that quote. He's like, the immigration department should be the HR department of the country. Like, that's what it should be. We should treat immigration like HR. It can't just be, always feels like in Canada, the different conversations about immigration. The lawyers are saying something else. The minister is saying something else. The resettlement agencies are saying something else. And in the end, we just have some hodgepodge stuff put together like porridge, and it doesn't taste. It's just bland, and there's a problem. So one is first, which for me is from your experience and someone who's been writing about this for a while. How do we even start to reframe the conversation to put one, the human narratives and lived experiences front and center? Because I feel like that's missing. It feels like we've turned immigration into some very, I almost want to say technical. It's almost like if you're trying to code and you put the code together and then it just starts to work. Like it feels like we've turned immigration into that. And then building on that, how do we even start to go from Canada versus the immigrant to Canada, a Canadian conversation? Because all the problems you state are a Canadian problem. And whether we want to put our heads in the sand, it's still going to come face us. We'll deal with newcomers or not. Like you said, there's like this example you just gave right now that is brilliant. If we gave birth to 400,000 kids today, immigrants or not, there's a problem. Are we going to blame the babies?
That's it, right? That's it. And you would say, well, okay, well, who do we got to blame somebody for this because it's a problem, or we could say, look, at one level, it is a technical discussion, and I think the question is how we balance having a human conversation and a technical conversation. Because the human conversation, I think you're absolutely right. These are people. These are human beings who have a moral right to be treated with dignity and fairness, and who have a right to justice. And that can never be something we forget at any level. We can't talk about waves of people. We can't talk about people flooding the borders. We can't, we can't engage in dehumanizing rhetoric about migrants, whether they're immigrants or temporary workers or refugees or whatever it might be. We need to see them first as human beings rather than statistics, because as soon as you start seeing someone in abstract terms, as soon as you start seeing them as a statistic, then all of a sudden they're no longer humans worthy of human treatment. And at the extreme version of that, you get genocide, right? Because the genocidal projects are projects of first dehumanizing people. I'm not saying that that's what's happening here. I'm just saying is that's the ultimate highest danger of this sort of logic or this sort of discourse. And I don't even want to start down that road one single step, even if the worst part of the destination is 100 kilometers away. I don't even want to take one step in that direction. So we need to keep that top of mind. But then we also need to have a technical discussion, because there are very specific policy problems that are going to take very particular technical solutions, which is, okay, well, how many people can we actually welcome to this country every year without running into a problem that's going to then fray the pro-immigration consensus that has been a part of this country for decades that we want to preserve and extend? So that's a technical question. How many houses do we need, and what kind of houses do we need? How much transit do we need, and what kind of transit do we need, and where? When people get here, who gets to decide where they go, and why? Right? Because Quebec's going to say, well, no, we want special control over immigrants, and we want them to come here if they meet X, Y, or Z, and we got to balance that. These are questions we have to solve. But then there's, on top of that, a further moral question, which is, what do we want from immigration, and what do we owe people who come here? And that moral question is like, what kind of person do you want to be? What kind of country do you want to be? Do you want to be the kind of country that is happy with using people like machines with a temporary foreign worker program, giving them very few rights when they get here, and then not extending citizenship rights to them when they're done? Or do we want to say, no, if people are willing to come here, take a risk coming here, put their bodies on the line, break their ass to work, maybe we owe them something more? And that's a moral question. So we have to keep those things in balance at a time where there's a real reactionary push both here and around the world. And it's really, really tough, because we're looking at Trump in the US. We're looking at the tariff threat that's going to come here, and that's going to upend and upset the already precarious relationship we have with migration. And that worries me a lot, because I think it's going to make things really, really tough for us. And I also think it's going to encourage a lot of dehumanizing and dangerous rhetoric. And I don't think our politicians are up to the task, because they haven't proven to be up to the task really during the good times. So what about during the real bad times? Like, I know it's not super encouraging. But you're right. Like what you said earlier, we will descend, we will become animals. Like there's a reason we still read Lord of the Flies, the better part of a century later, or a little bit less than that, because it does speak to our just utter animal nature when we're really up against those battles. Not everyone all the time, but
Yeah.
that certainly comes out.
And the sad part about it is that most of us, most people, the human tendency most of the time is to sit back and and say, I'm not them. They're the ones doing it. But then what that means is that then people suffer much longer than they should, because most people just sit back and watch. I mean, like someone will always say, people always wonder, how did loving Germans turn into something under Hitler, and became all that? Like, because people sat back and watched, and over time, the more you sit with something, the more you become that thing if you're not careful enough. And I'm wondering, like, do you think that it's possible to craft stories of shared prosperity where in which both immigrants and the existing communities are seen as partners, building a more equitable, robust nation, a place where everyone, do you think that's possible? I mean, I feel like you already said it's going to be hard in the next couple of years just because of all that's going on. But do you think that's possible? Do you have any tools or any ideas how one can approach that?
I think it's possible, and it has been done, and Canada has a very, at the best, mixed history with immigration, going back to its founding. I mean, the country is founded on stealing land, so it's complicated from day one, obviously, and that land, much of it remains unceded. It's still stolen land, and that I'm a squatter in Ottawa on Algonquin land, on unceded land. Right. When I was in Vancouver, I was a squatter on unceded land. So you got to keep that in mind too. And for all the talk of our multicultural heritage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, when the Syrian refugee crisis went down, we got real cold real fast. And then on top of that, there's the added complexity of we were much more generous with Ukrainians than we were with Syrians. So what does that tell us? What does that say about how we construct an immigrant and different kinds of immigrants? So we have to reckon with all those different layers. But when I think about trying to tell different sort of stories, I often think of local community. I grew up in a town where everybody looked like me. There were very, very few people who didn't look like me. I'm from Peterborough. That's changed, I think, at least a little bit, but I didn't know. But then I went to Ottawa to school and was in classes and in clubs and playing rec sports with people who didn't look like me, who didn't come from the same place I came from. And I started making attachments to them and started to understand, oh, I get it. This is what it looks like, And now I'm almost 41 and I live in a suburban neighborhood that is very diverse, people from all around the world, and they're just members of my community. And that's how I think of them. And I think of them as pretty much the same as me in the sense that I see them as a human being who's trying to get through the day. And if they want to be a Canadian, then I'm like, okay, great. You're a Canadian to me. That's enough. And I think you can build those relationships at the local level, and then you start to see people differently, but you got to get everything stirred up together. And it's funny because I contrasted a little bit to, I lived in South Korea for a couple of years, 10 years ago, longer actually. And I had my little alien registration card, as they called it, and I was teaching, and I was one of those. But, I knew I was never going to be Korean, and I was never going to fit into Korea. I could learn a bit of the language as I did. I could appreciate the history and culture as I did. I could go out with Korean friends as I did. But I was always going to be kind of on the outside. And I understood that and accepted that, especially since I wasn't going to stay. But I still made a little bit of community, and that was really powerful. And I'm thinking, but then here we could even have a force multiplier where that could be even more powerful, because we can say to people, if you want to be a Canadian, guess what? You're a Canadian. And you're here for the long haul, and so am I, and we're just trying to figure this out together. And now we're on the same team. We're not competing over resources. We're cooperating against a variety of forces, including, the marketplace that might want to exploit us, or the politician who doesn't want to serve us, or whatever. And now we're cooperating, and we're not divided along arbitrary lines of where we happen to have been born, because that's all accidental and arbitrary, right? And I think if we can start seeing things that way, there's some hope. But we're going to have to resist those in the business community or in the political community that are going to want to divide us along those lines of Canadian immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. Because quite frankly, at least at an abstract level, I don't really understand why some kid who was born here 6 months ago is worth more or ought to have more rights than an immigrant who came here 6 months ago. Like, why? Because of an arbitrary line we've drawn, that history has drawn? I'm not convinced by that. Just because you're here? Like, you haven't done anything. You're just having to be here. But that's just by way of saying it boils down to, like, how do we figure this out together as people in the community, rather than how do we fight over ever dwindling resources, because there's actually a lot of resources out there. One of the things I always say is, the old economics line is, well, this is about scarcity. I'm like, that is actually kind of bullshit. Scarcity isn't exactly the problem we think it is. There's a lot of resources out there. The distribution of those resources, though, is a problem.
Conversation. Yeah, that's the problem. But like they say, some people would never want you to have that conversation, because then it starts to get messy once you start saying, oh, let's talk about distribution. Let's talk about just trying to make things a bit more equitable. They're like, no, we don't want that. No.
It's not the free market. It's blah, 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 blah.
I'm like, is it really a free market? Like, are you just saying it's a free market? It's not really a free market. It's not. Like, don't do that to me. Like, don't gaslight me.
It's a free market sort of in the way that, like, it's a fair race around the track when some people start 30 meters from the finish line and other people start 500 meters from the finish line. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's a nice free and fair race, I guess, but not really. And then by the time you start scaling that analogy up globally, and then you add on a history and present of colonialism, you're like, oh, it's not like that person is 500 meters behind me, not even by accident. It's because I pushed them back there. And then when they say, oh, do you mind if I move up so that we are kind of closer together? You're like, no, I've earned this spot at the front.
Yeah.
By what? By what?
Force.
By force, by luck, by some combination of the two. And something like that actually is not a good reason.
And I really like how you put it, because really it's really us. Like, because that thing about the local community really plays a huge role in what happens. Because I feel like we do a lot of work where we push it to the politicians. It's about time we start saying to ourselves, like, how do we create a more informed, a more compassionate conversation around Canada and the immigrant? Because really, it's Canadian story is an immigration story. Like, Canada is an immigration story from day one. Mm-hmm. So trying to have a Canada and then have the newcomers who are coming now are different. It gets a bit like, what are we really talking about?
And how do we want to approach it? And at the end of the day, I think we want to approach it by cooperating and building solidarity. And I think I see people day to day, first and foremost, as like human beings who are trying to get through the day. And like every other human being, sometimes I get a little irritated. I'm like, speed up, get out, turn, the light is yellow, you're turning left, go, 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 go. We all have those little kind of human irritants. But we're all trying to get through the day. Most of us are workers. Most of us have family connections. We have ambitions. We have dreams. We share most of those types of things in common. And we get more by collaborating, cooperating than by competing, especially when we look around and say, oh, you know what? I share more in common probably with this newcomer who's a wage employee or a low salaried or medium salaried employee than I do with economic elites and politicians who are telling me that they're the cause of my problems. And so what if we start building solidarity at that level? And to come back to an earlier point, I think that's core, is building that community, building that cooperation, building that solidarity, and seeing that we share these things in common, and then being very wary of people at the top who are telling us to fight amongst ourselves. Because they tell you to fight amongst yourselves so that you don't turn around and be like, maybe actually you are the problem. Maybe maybe we should be doing things differently. Maybe that's sort of your job. And maybe if you
Yeah.
can't do that, we'll find someone else. And again, I don't want to be too cliched about it, but I think of Marx all the time, and how he argued that the politicians were effectively servants of the market, of the capital class. And like, yeah, that's why you get the temporary foreign worker program.
Yeah.
You don't get that program if politicians aren't the servants of the capital class. We got to do something about that, because there are real consequences when we don't, right? It's just human consequences, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it leaves us all poorer at the end of the day too. Although I will say this, I will flag this, just because I always have to flag it for my own conscience, is that I struggle with something that is, for me, a big moral question, but at once sort of none of my business. So I never really know how to approach it, which is, when you take immigrants out of a country, you're taking people away from that country. And if it's their free choice to leave that country, then I absolutely respect that. And I would never tell them what to do. But I always feel a little bit like it's another extractive industry that the Canadian state has engaged in, which is taking people from their own country and bringing them here.
That is a very interesting.
And I'm like, well, you know what? It's not my job to say, because if someone wants to come here, I'm not going to, it's not my business. And if they want to leave their home country, that's not my business. But I'm always like, we're like, well, we want doctors and lawyers and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, I'm sure those countries would love to have doctors and lawyers. So I never really know what to think about that. I struggle with that a lot.
Yeah, that's a very dark place to go, because it's a very dark place, because, and I think that I would almost dare say that what makes it worse is how the immigration discourse is had these days. Like, when you start to talk about people like economic units, then this becomes really, really dark, because then the question is, but yeah, back home, that country needs those people. And the fact that I probably have more opportunities as a country gives me the power to attract those people. And like you said, people will say, but yeah, they made a choice to go because everyone wants a better life. And that's fair, But then it kind of goes back to, so in the end, is the world just an economic canvas where everyone is playing the strong eat the weak, and then the weak dies off? Like, it's such a dark place, because like I have never thought about it this way before, but I just said, I was like, gosh, okay, that is something scary.
Well, it's tricky, but you're right. The economic unit frame is just, or I would say the utilitarian frame is the one that politicians adopt. And even when it came to recent immigration discourse, I mean, it's so cynical. Politicians would say, yeah, it's hard to have so many newcomers. We don't have enough houses for them, but those newcomers will build the houses. It's like, oh my God. So we're trying to sell immigration now to the country, politicians, by saying, okay, yeah, it's a lot of people, but they'll build the houses. And we need them to build the houses. And that might be true, but there's something perverse about that, right? Saying, well, we can't welcome new people, there aren't enough houses, but we can bring them in if they'll build their own house, basically, right? And one for you too. And so, but because the logic of that is ultimately, no, they're economic units that we want to maximize. And I was like, and these are the same politicians, by the way, who don't want a command economy. They're the same politicians who don't want, the state to decide where everybody works, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Except when it comes to immigration, all of a sudden they're all central planners, right? And so I just think it's so utterly cynical. But also, there's truth to the fact that we do need to build houses, and we got to reckon with that somehow. And we just turn to so dehumanizing or dispassionate, kind of robotic conceptions of these conversations that forget that the point you raised earlier, these are humans, and it doesn't leave us in a nice place.
Yeah, because in the end, that the jump between utilitarian to, gosh, these people are a problem. It's not a huge jump. Like it's just it's literally just a step. Like you just step into that easily because right from day one, all you've done is look at them as people who you want to maximize. And so there's no human conversation. There's no, okay, these are humans that are coming and they become part of my local community and become a people. Because something you said earlier, which is so right, is that really in the end, it's not me versus the immigrant. It's me versus the leader. And the immigrant is literally in the same boat with me. Even if the difference is that I earn 100K and he earns 60K, the point is that we still go through the same problems. No doctors, no houses, inflation is up. I can't buy groceries. Like all those same problems, and they have the same dreams I have, and they want to just live a good life like you do. And so the difference is just so minute. But then we've created these things that allow us to just pit people against each other and then allows them to continue doing the things they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, exactly. And it's funny because I don't want to erase difference. This is one thing. I don't want to pretend that, we're all the same color. We're not.
yeah.
We all have the same history. We don't.
No.
Someone who comes from Bangladesh is the same as someone who's born in Peterborough.
No.
Nope. Different. But yet we, at the end of the day, do share common goals. We share a common class in many cases. We share common struggles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I want to see us balancing those things. It's funny because on my street, the houses that are kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 around me, and immediately, there are 2 houses with people who look like me and 3 houses with people who don't. Who come. I don't know if the folks were born here. I know a few of them came from abroad and that they live here now, and they're my neighbors. And when I see them, you know what I think? I think we're all trying to figure out how to keep our walks shoveled and salted, how to take down our Christmas lights, et cetera, et cetera. They've got a whole world and story there. But it's funny when on first glance, when I first see them, I see them fundamentally as a human being who's like trying to figure out how to manage all the snow and ice next door. And these are the things we talk about. We have that immediate and that sounds so trite, but it's actually, in a sense, fundamentally relevant to the conversation we're having. It's like, oh, right, there's a human who's got a problem. And I don't know the conditions under which people come to this country, but they come to it because they've got a different problem to solve. They get here, then they got new problems to solve. And it's just a series of cascading problems. And I don't like the idea that we're looking at this, or we're being conditioned to look at these people solving their problems as a cause of our own problems. And this is one of the themes in this conversation. We've got to come back to the fundamental posture that we're sharing ultimately many of the same problems, and we get more by cooperating than competing, and we get more together than we get by being divided by politicians and by people in the market who want us divided. And we can do that while also recognizing that there's lots of differences among us too, and those differences ought to be seen and recognized and understood and appreciated when they need to be appreciated, or managed where they need to be managed. And we can do that. Like, we have a lot of capacity, we have a lot of intelligence, we have a lot of emotional depth, but we just cannot let ourselves be divided among arbitrary lines, as different as we may be in some senses, the same as we may be in others. Like, we just cannot allow ourselves to be sundered to serve someone else's ends. Like, we've got to we're solidarity first, and I don't care where you came from.
This should be a good place to end this because that's such a good monologue.
I mean, that's.
But I have one last question for you, which is, do you think personal stories can help get us down this line? Like, you know, documental and anecdotal. You think you can help?
Oh, I do for sure. I absolutely do, because again, when someone is a statistic, it's abstract. When you say Canada is aiming to welcome 400,000 immigrants, as we were, a year ago, I don't really know what that means. I mean, I know that's a lot of people. I know that's, almost half the size of Ottawa, right? Ottawa's a little more than 1 million people. It's 40% the size of Ottawa. That's a lot of people. I and it sounds like a big imposing thing, and I have no context for that really in terms of what it actually means. But when you then dig down and say, well, like what's the story behind those 400,000 people? Where are they from? Why are they coming here? Why do they want to come here? What are they doing when they get here? What do they look like in my community? Let's hear a little bit about that. Then all of a sudden it's real. I don't know what it means to welcome 400,000 people other than, oh no, we don't have enough houses. I do understand what it means then when I walk out my door and see my neighbors from around the world and, see what their life looks like and hear where they came from and why, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that I get. And I think people really respond to that level of the human level when it's discursive, when it's part of a story, because we just are made, or we've evolved, I should say, to process stories because they're not abstract, they're real. And it's really, really powerful. And go back and look at 2015 and the utterly tragic, heartbreaking photo of the small boy, the Kurdi boy, who died on a beach in Greece, face down. And that photo, which is seared in the mind of anyone who saw it, is also a story of a family trying to cross, to flee, who lost their young child, and others died in that crossing too. And then all of a sudden it becomes very, very real. It's not this abstract question of refugees coming to this country. It's this very real, very visceral reality that people are putting their lives on the line to flee something, and they're human beings who just want to live, want to survive, want to get through the day. And that's not a number on a page. It's a human life that you can immediately appreciate, and you can even feel, because you can empathize. Like, that could have been my kid, right? That could have been me in a different world. And that's really, really powerful. Now, it shouldn't have to be that way. We should be able to look at a statistic and say, okay, 400,000, that's a lot of people. I don't care. I hope they all have a great day and they can come here and be happy and treated well and respectful, with respect and dignity. But we kind of don't. So the stories end up being really, really powerful, really, really important, but not always enough. And that's the one caveat, is that stories are really powerful. They do a lot of work. They can move opinion. They can sway you emotionally. But if there's still that competition over resources, and we're still being sundered as a community, then the stories might not be enough. But we should still try to tell them, and we should still hear them, because it does foster more of a connection. And ultimately what it boils down to is making a connection with people as people. And travel does that too. Years ago, it's funny, there's this myth of the nice, kind Canadians, and we're the most polite, nice people in the world. And it's funny, is I travel the world, I go to other countries, I'm like, you know what? There's a lot of nice people everywhere.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
There's a lot of nice people everywhere I've been. People have been kind of nice. I don't, I everyone's really nice, because at the end of the day, most people are like fundamentally fairly decent, right?
Exactly.
So I'm like, okay, well, that's a start. And I think I do think it really does. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it is a struggle to build solidarity against forces that want to tear that solidarity apart to serve their own ends, right? And that's what the work is, building solidarity and building it against these arbitrary lines we keep dividing ourselves with, or allowing others to divide us with, because it just yields better things. And
Yeah.
that's the struggle. That's the daily struggle.
Yeah. And I think maybe building on that, the reason why stories are important, because stories sort of help us start the work of building the connections that help us fight the other things that stories can do. Because stories can fight those arbitrary forces. Like stories help us come together and be like, no, I disagree. Like, I understand who they are, I understand why they behave the way they behave, or rather, I see why they behave the way they behave. And I know that there's some middle ground somewhere. There's not just some wall between both of us. Like, because like you said, like you go around the world and you meet people and you're like, we're not that special. We're a lot of special people all over the world who are just like me. you know. But yeah. It's gonna be some yeah.
It's going to be a tough couple of years, but it makes the work of building solidarity even more important. And I think wherever there's that challenge, wherever there's some power that's pushing against people trying to unite across gender lines, across racial lines, across national lines, there's a resistance to that power as well. And you can be a part of that resistance by building that local community, by building that solidarity and scaling it up, no matter, where the person you're scaling with happens to be from. And so I have a little bit of hope that we can do that work, because I think it's more important now than it's been in a really, really long time. So, let's go tell those stories. Let's go have those conversations. And then when time comes, we know who to link arms with.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Gosh. Thank you. You've given me a ton of hope, because, I mean, the past couple, like, I spent the holidays just thinking about, like what is the conversation for this year? Because last year I felt like a ton of stuff thrown, and I'm like, we can't get into this. As an immigrant, I can't start saying, oh, no, I can't start doing that. And it's not me versus the Canadian, or no, it's we are all in this together. And if we don't figure this out together, then we're all in trouble. We're just all in trouble. So thank you.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. If there's one thing you take from these, please build your local community. Because that's one way in which we can have a better society. I'm tired of all this, oh, the immigrant is that, or the Canadians that this. No, it's tiring. But yeah, thank you so much for getting to this point of the episode. I always appreciate that. Please like, subscribe, share. If you know someone we should talk to, send them my way. If you know someone who will find this useful, please share with them. Have a beautiful day. Ciao.